Well, we're really excited to have Dr. Sheli Reynolds here with us today on the Accessible Podcast. And Sheli, welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here and share information with you.
Great. So today we're going to be, we're really excited to learn about supporting families. And I guess I'd just like to start with how you got into this field and this became an area where you do a lot of your work.
Well, so I bring both personal and professional experience to the field, to this job. I have a brother who is 42 with a developmental disability who was a foster child and came to us as a family when he was about 18 months old and required a lot of additional supports. And as a family, we made the decision that we wanted him to be a part of our family. And so with that decision came a lot of doctors, a lot of therapists, a lot of special education, a lot of figuring out how to navigate the system. And I was pretty young. I was probably in 5th or 6th grade when he came to our family. And so had the role of having this new member of our family as a young child, but also was old enough to start kind of understanding a little bit what's going on. As he got older, supports and services got harder. And so as a family, by the time I was in high school, I knew I wanted to do something in the disability field, but I played soccer. And so finding a art program, a soccer program, and a disability program were all of my 3 passions in high school. And so I started to look at sign language interpreting, occupational therapy, and my last month of high school were required to do a volunteer program. And at that time, my little brother was going on Monday to Fridays and staying in a place called St. Mary's Special School out of St. Louis. And it was horrific on our family because they would drop him off on a Monday morning and pick him up on a Friday.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's where I did my volunteerism. And I started working in the preschool and learned a lot about supporting people of all ages, learned a lot about the occupational therapy field, and ended up actually at Rockhurst here getting my occupational therapy degree. Mm-hmm. While I was there, stumbled upon UMKC Institute for Human Development and never left. I've been here for 26 years. I was here as a student. Had no idea that I was going to stay here, but I think the experiences of really being able to work on policy and systems change is really what has continued to evolve me in this career.
Yeah. And I guess we should, just let everyone know that we work with you at the Institute for Human Development.
That's true.
So,
Yes.
It's fun to talk to a coworker today.
But before we get into that, I'd like to go back to like when you were in 5th or 6th grade and, as your brother, I don't know if he had any diagnoses at that time or, what was that like for you as a sibling at a young age and maybe for your family to discover that he had disabilities?
So he came to us at 18 months old and couldn't hold his head up and had no control of his body. Essentially, the doctor said that he wasn't going to live, take him home and just love him. He was malnourished and there were clearly some other indicators of something going on in his development. And so we just played with him like a newborn, right? Yeah. Even though he was not a newborn. And then as he got older, it became evident that his speech was going to be delayed. He had muscle tone issues. And I think what was really probably the hardest growing up is that he, I always say, utilizes behaviors as a form of his communication.
Right.
And so that causes the most challenges, I think, with families when they have an individual in their family who, you can't take them to grandma's house without worrying about something happening. And so, as a sibling, there are a few times that I remember, it was more about worrying about what other people thought about you.
Yeah.
And so there's some very distinct, potentially traumatic experiences that we've had. I remember one time vividly taking him to the grocery store by myself. I was like, I thought I was a cool, like 16 or 17-year-old or whatever. And, some trigger went off of that grocery store, man. And I was by myself and, had to block the aisles off. Everyone's staring at you. They want to help. They want to stare, and just thinking, wow, this is hard, and again, it was more because and so I see, it's really hard not to self-isolate as a family, right?
Yeah.
And then I remember other times I was pretty little. I remember we were at Burger King, we were out on the slide and we were playing and Eric was just playing along and there was other little kids and all of a sudden they started like talking about him and, pointing at him and saying things about him and like, we didn't understand that. We're like, what are they doing? And it hurt, right? And luckily, Eric had no idea. He didn't care. It was more us.
More.
Yeah. So I mean, I think some of those things, as a family member, it really is the attitude of the community.
Yeah.
It's interesting the medical diagnosis or the medical perspective that they had of your brother when they first placed him with your family. What do you think sort of your family's approach or expectation on your brother's life and development impacted kind of his trajectory? Because he obviously didn't pass at 18 months.
Right. It's kind of funny. So, fast forward to, charting the life course or supporting families, which is what a lot of the body of my work is. We weren't a diagnosis driven family. And you really are just trying to survive or create a quality of life. And so you're like, oh, friends, let's go do something. We want to go on vacation. We want to do things. So we weren't thinking about the diagnosis and we kind of laugh because, we had many foster children growing up and you just brought them in and you loved them. You didn't know where they were going to go, how long they were going to be with you. And so we like to tease ourselves and say that some of Eric's adult nuances are because we just loved him and maybe didn't give him all the natural consequences he should have had as a child because, we just probably let him do whatever he wanted to do, because it was like, and as you know, like we were older, I have a twin brother and an older brother. So we were older. And so he was the center of our world.
Sure. Right.
And so you don't really think about it. And, I don't know, obviously I didn't experience being in a family when a child is born with a diagnosis. So, I mean, we knew that there were going to be additional supports needed. But I don't think you think about it. You just think that he came into our lives and he was supposed to be in our lives. And we had no idea the hurdles that we were going to face as a family. Right. Which is probably good you don't know.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Well, it seemed like you sort of approached it from like exactly like you said, we're going to go on vacation. We're not going to not go on vacation, or we're not going to not do these things. And we're bringing Eric along for the ride, right? And that impacts his quality of life as well.
And you do, and this is probably what every single family will tell you across the entire lifespan is that, those little day-to-day activities that you do as a family seem really natural, but we have to put a lot of thought into it. We're like, did we give them enough time to prepare? Are we going to create some sort of incident? Or did we, did we tell him too soon? Because then he's going to ask about it for 2 hours. Or, what's your exit plan if you go somewhere and something happens? So you are constantly planning for the what if. As a family. And so like that just becomes your new reality.
Right. So does that carry into now you're, all adults, including Eric? Like how does that carry into your planning now or
absolutely? It doesn't go away, right? Because Eric still requires, 24-hour oversight, so to speak. And so he does, need supports with people understanding his communication style. He is very fidgety. He loves to, get himself into very innovative situations. His favorite thing to do is to tie things up and use chains and keys and connect things. And so, all of a sudden, things will be very connected together. Your cars will be connected together and you can't get them apart. Or, you have to be aware of the environment. You have to be aware of something that he's going to find creative in the environment. And you also have to, you have to be very cautious of, or be very mindful of almost his characteristics, because you can see when something's going to switch, right? And you just got to be prepared to get up and leave or figure out how you're going to distract them.
Right.
And so I think for my parents who are now aging, it's harder and harder because they don't want to leave that to somebody else all the time. But it's finding both staff and siblings and others that mom and dad can only relax if they trust the person that he's with, because they can never fully relax even when he's not around, because they're worried that those little things that someone might not be ready for is going to happen.
Yeah. So you became an occupational therapist, which, obviously you're not practicing that now, but how did, growing up with Eric, then impact the career decisions you made and where you are?
I honestly thought I was going to be a graphic designer. I mean, I honestly thought that was what I was going to do.
It actually makes a lot of sense.
I know anyone that knows Sheli.
Art background that you have, but so much is coming together for me as your quote from that's why she's really good with visuals. I may or may not have a logo design in my bag, but I was like, I'm seeing Sheli and George later, and maybe I should have them weigh in on this. So
especially Sheli.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And so, I think that I don't really know. I started to go to Rockhurst. You don't know what you want to do when you're, a freshman in college. So I did what everybody does that doesn't know what they want to do. And I went into psychology, right? And then it was like, wow, Rockhurst had a physical therapy and occupational therapy degree program that you could do as your 5th year. And that was pretty cool. And I didn't really understand what occupational therapy is. I don't think most people understand what occupational therapy is. But it really is just like its title, right? And it's really about, I always tell people, it's your everyday activities of daily living, or even your instrumental ones, right? Your executive functioning and your bills and that kind of stuff. Just kind of went through it. And it's funny because I got out and my dad's like, so you finished school and you're never going to use that degree. And ironically, I would say almost everything that I've done at the Institute has actually leveraged that degree without really thinking about it. I think it serves as an amazing foundational degree. I actually think it should be a pathway for more professionals in the disability field, which is why it's fun, because we just hired an OT. Because you might not want to provide direct therapeutic occupational therapy, but I think the fact that if you think about again, the framework that has evolved, it's all about thinking about what the person wants and driving that. And that's person-centered practices. And occupational therapy has always said, you might need all these things done, but that's not going to be your treatment plan. Your treatment plan is, what do you want to work on?
Yeah.
I mean, so it's the underpinnings of everything we're moving the disability field to. So started doing that. And, a lot of occupational therapists from Rockhurst would come over here and do internships at the USED here. And so I came along and started doing that under Dr. Chris Rink and learned about aging and disability. And, the rest is history.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Chris Rink, for,
Yeah,
right.
for
absolutely.
bringing Sheli in.
I also am biased to starting as a student and then never leaving. I mean, people do it like myself. So
They do, right? And I think I always tell people like that are talking about going into the disability field, or even if that's not the field you want to go into, like, you know, when you're in college or even high school, you just think of like the big careers. You know, I'm going to go into business. I'm going to go into this or that. I mean, if someone said, oh, you're going to go work on systems change and policy change, and you're going to do it through the lens of research, I'd be like, I don't understand anything you just said to me.
Yeah.
Like, how do you get on that trajectory? You have no idea, right?
Right.
And so I think the thing that is awesome, you know, about working here is that, you know, every single day is different, right? So like one day I can be working like one-on-one with families, impacting their plans and thinking about how to help them support their loved ones. And then the next day we're working on national policy change. And I think that you know, I think the background in occupational therapy allows for both that sort of person level all the way up to that social ecological level of policy change.
Yeah. So, I mean, you just kind of mentioned, you know, two things that we're interested in learning from you, just related. I mean, so I know that when, you know, given our history, all of our history here, I know that, you know, when you started, you were in individual advocacy, our individual advocacy program, moved into our family to family network. And so let's start talking about that. Like how did you get into that? And what was that sort of?
You know, I think being a sibling has brought a really unique perspective and advantage to where I think our field was as I grew up in this field. And so the family support movement, you know, has been evolving for many years, right? The disability field wouldn't be here if it weren't for families really pushing in the 30s, 40s, and 50s for some sort of programming. And then you really look to the 90s and you really look at, you know, the Turnbull family and some of the other sort of greats around family support. And that was really looking at how are we supporting families. And at the time, it was really about how are we supporting families so that they don't move their children to institutions. And so there was a lot of programs and policies that started in the 90s. And if you think about the early 90s, the late 80s, that's when our home and community-based service waivers started, which was a form of family support without calling it family support, because it really allowed people to keep their loved one in their community, in their home, right? So between the home and community-based waivers and IDA passing, because they also say the other form of family support was when your kid could go to school. And so I just remember going to this big national meeting that was hosted at KU, the Beach Center over there. And they were bringing together. I
think I was at that same thing.
You were.
But we didn't know each other.
No.
Right?
That's wild.
And they brought together national leaders around family support. And then they brought together national leaders from the self-advocacy movement. And there was a big, huge fight between the two movements. And it was amazing to look back and be a part of that historical movement, because I always talk about the fact that, you know, think about the movements as if that was a teenager, right? You've got to like express your own independence and launch your own personhood from your parents in order to like figure out who you are. But that doesn't mean you're not a part of the family, right? And so I think it was self-advocates really expressing that like family's voice is very important. Their needs are very important, but you can't do it without the context of the person. And so for me, I was in a really interesting position because I was supporting People First Missouri, and I was a sibling. And so it was kind of parents against children, right? Adult self-advocates. And so in a sibling, you were right in this sort of neutral position, because you could experience it from both sides, right? You could both be the advocate for the person, and you could both also see where the parents are coming from as a family member. So that, that was when I started to like realize there's other siblings out there. And so that was, really good. Fast forward to 2011, when I was asked to be a part of the leadership team to bring together and create another one of those summits. We very intentionally recognized that we needed to address that elephant in the room, and that that's where the phrase supporting families came from, and that's where the phrase supporting the person within the context of their family came from. And I really think it's, for probably 7 years, I supported the People First movement here in Missouri and nationally. And I always said that like, that's probably was some of the greatest training and experience I ever had.
Absolutely.
Right. And I always said, to be able to rub elbows and be in the trenches, the life trenches of people with disabilities in cars for hours, driving all over the state, all over the country, and I always said, listening to the underground stories, not the stories you hear about in the person center planning meeting, but like, how they're sneaking out and, have boyfriends and girlfriends and they want tattoos and, like real life stories, served as an underpinning to, I think, being able to then start thinking about supporting the entire family, because it's every single family member,
right.
And I think that that's where the national agenda on supporting families is. And you would ask earlier, why did I tell you to switch from family support to supporting families? It was very, very intentional in 2011 that we did that. Family support became known in our country as a program.
Right.
It was also very identified with the sort of child welfare system. And so it didn't have a lot of meaning anymore in the disability community. Or it became a program, meaning only this group of people can get this family support service.
Like very specific to eligibility criteria.
Yeah. And so when we met in Wisconsin for the National Agenda Supporting Families, and we brought together, 35 national leaders from around the country, we said, we don't have a better phrase to call it, but we don't want to call it family support. We want to create a national agenda on supporting families, because the idea was it's not about a program. It's about creating and providing anticipatory guidance to family and not just being reactive and only getting certain families or the caregivers into these programs. And so that's really when we flipped the language. And you can see it now across the country.
So practically speaking, I think, especially knowing that how many students maybe listen to these episodes, you're a clinician or you're a case manager and you're working with an individual. Why support the family? And what does that look like when my job deliverable is to work with this individual to make like a case management plan, but like you said, they're embedded in the context of their family. So talk a little bit about, and they might say, well, we don't have a program for families here. I don't have anything I can offer you, but what actually could they offer? And I think that's the big messaging that we are doing around the country. And so the first thing I always tell somebody is like, there is no way to remove the genetics of my family. So you can't know me and know what I need if you don't know my family and my genetics, right? And maybe I don't even know who my family is, but my genetics, the color of my eyes, the way that I look, the way my health is related to your family. You also have to think about the context of the family, of the environment that I'm coming from. So if I either live or don't live with my family, did I grow up on a farm? Did I, does my family, how are they, what is that environment like? But the other point that I make specifically about people with developmental disabilities is that probably 85% of people with disabilities live at home with their family throughout their entire lifespan. Wow.
And so to ignore the family unit and that family environment, you can't support that person.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So you could create the greatest treatment plan or the greatest person-centered plan.
Sure.
They're going back home to their family. And so if that's not in there in the cards, or they don't understand it, and I use two examples when I'm kind of really honing in on this. The first example is like, okay, so what if I'm treating a 13-year-old with autism? And I ignore the fact that maybe mom is working 2 jobs, or has a newborn at home, or is taking care of her mother who's sick and living in the home. So you think as a clinician that your plan is the most important plan in that family's life, and it's one of many plans. Or mom's too depressed and can't get out of bed, right? So she's going to be your implementer of your plan. And if it doesn't work in that lifestyle, or the other one is I work a lot over the years with voc rehab counselors, and I would say 5-6 years ago they were like, the family is not our primary beneficiary. So quite frankly, we don't really interact with families at all. And we said, well, how do you think you're going to get this individual to want to have a job, to have expectations to have a job, to get to a job?
Right.
And so it was interesting, really, as the federal push looking at sort of Workforce Investment Act and transition planning is to really think about that transition age. I had a team of adult employment providers and voc rehab counselors sitting around, and they said, we got this totally figured out for this person. We figured out how he's going to get there. We figured out what job he's going to be. We found the employer. Everyone was excited. We forgot to tell the family.
Right.
And the family's like, nope, they're not working there.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And so, you can't ignore the impact the person has on the family, or that the family has on that individual. And sometimes you have to also recognize that, like, they're trying to balance that. And then sometimes it's overbalanced towards the family more than the individual. So you have to figure out how to facilitate that.
Right. That speaks to a little bit maybe the conflict between the two movements. I'm curious, are there still summits where self-advocates and family members come together like that? And in the past maybe 10, 15 years, have you seen some of those tensions relieved as the language has changed? Maybe, I don't know, here in Missouri or nationally, or do you think it's still a hurdle that is being overcome?
So we had, I still think it's a big hurdle that needs to be overcome. We had a 10-year later summit in 2022 up in DC. And so we invited a number of the same self-advocates from the 2011 summit, as well as a number of those self-advocates were actually at the Beach Centers summit. And then it included some other self-advocates. I think that, it's always going to be the, nothing about us without us. And I think as a whole system, we have to get better at that. I think that people default and think it's easier to have family members there and say the lived experience is represented.
Yeah.
And I think that, Julie Petty is a really good friend of mine, and she's really pushing, how do we intentionally teach parents how to be allies? And I think that needs to be taught, in the sense that, your child is 18, even if they require supports, how are you helping them have their own personhood? How are you helping them have their own voice? And I typically angle it, especially when I'm working with older families, is like, your voice isn't going to be there. So either you need to help them have a voice, or help those around them, help them have, know that voice.
Yeah.
Because in the end, could harm them.
Yeah. I just want to go back and say that Julie Petty is at the Arkansas, you said, and is a great partner of Shelley's and of ours, as you said.
Yeah, and the other thing I want to say is that, what was really So in the 90s, they funded a lot of family support programs. It's in a lot of state legislations, and then in the early 2000s, everybody wanted to fund self-advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
Now you fast forward to 2020 and no one wants to fund either of them, but they keep saying how important both of them are.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that, that's important. I think the other thing that is really important to keep in mind that I appreciate about, fast forwarding to 2022 is the diversity, both the cultural diversity, the language diversity, the diversity of disabilities and abilities. But most importantly, those self-advocates are families themselves.
Yeah.
And so they're parents, they're married, they're spouses. And I think that part of the equation is often missing when you're talking about supporting families.
So Sheli, one of the things that people around the country know you most for is your work in developing the Charting the Life course framework. And I guess the question is, how does that work influenced by your commitment to supporting families? And
well, so it's interesting. So it started. So after we had Wing Spread in 2011, we received a federal grant in partnership with the National Association for State Directors on Developmental Disability Services to create what's called a community of practice, where we started in 6 states and we said, we're going to bring stakeholders together and we're going to figure out what state policies need to be written, what practices need to be developed to truly support families across the lifespan. Because what we found is there's early childhood programs, there's aging programs, but there's really nothing for families of 18 to 62-year-olds. Right. And that's the longest lifespan, right? And so you have families talking about how their children have graduated to the couch. And so that's when families need the most support. And so that community of practice is still going strong. It's now states, actually, it's not federally funded at all anymore, and it's in 22 states. And when that community of practice started, we went through and did an environmental scan of all of the family-centered principles that existed, along with the values and principles of the DD Act. And we pulled out all of the family support stuff. And we started to use those principles for our community of practice. And so we adopted those principles as the national agenda in supporting families principles. And, full circle back to graphic design, right? I was asked to go around the country and present on those principles. Well, I saw those principles as colors and images and icons. And so made PowerPoint slides. And the states that we were working in were like, oh, those are really cool. Make that into a worksheet. And so we would make it into a worksheet. And more importantly than the tools themselves are the principles.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that happened nationally is, you've got Center for Medicaid Services that really started to create policy around person-centered thinking and person-centered practices. So that was kind of happening right around the same time. And so, again, we kept pushing that supporting families was about larger systems change and not just a program, and that it was about changing what we would say the DNA of the entire service system. So I'm not just training family support workers, I'm training every case manager to think differently about a family. I'm looking at every policy to impact both the person and the family. And so those principles evolved into what I considered person-centered and family-centered principles. That was the other thing that was happening, is that there was kind of a power struggle between people that were really pushing person-centered practices and those that were pushing family-centered practices, saying that neither could exist together. And Charting the Life course actually integrates those together and really says you can support the person within the context of their family. That doesn't override that person's self-determination and their independence and their, it actually fosters it. And so the Charting the Life course framework has now evolved to almost being complementary or really even pushing person-centered thinking into what we call of a more human-centric framework or more citizen-centered framework.
Not only that, but the tools are so great and helpful, I think, for vision planning, that we use them for like advisory groups, strategic meetings when we're thinking about projects. And I've seen them and both use them in my projects. And so it's really they're neat tools that get people on the same page to think through things together. How can people who are not familiar with Charting Life Course, like how can they tap into that and learn about how people are applying the tools?
So lifecoursetools.org is a website that all the tools are on there. There's videos on there, and there's opportunities to get involved on there. I think that, when we design the tools, and kind of going back to what you just said, they were always intended and developed by individuals with disabilities and their families. And they aren't disability specific, but it always was written in a way that recognized the person. Like I go back to our core belief that it's about all people, have the right to live, love, work, and play in their community, because I felt like sometimes in the disability field, we created a different core belief for people with disabilities. Mm-hmm. And then that just created the segregation again and created a whole specialized route of programs for people with disabilities. And so the tools I think are really cool in that they're designed to help the person think about their own life, but I can use that exact same tool to do transformational change for legislation or for program development or needs assessments. And so for us, it's about creating a language that every kind of person in the system can be a part of. Because that's, I think, the other thing for individuals with disabilities and their families. We have systems speak, or we have professionals speak, or we have research speak, and they can't participate. And the Life Course framework can create plain language that all of the different players can communicate with.
Yeah.
And that national community of practice you had mentioned that started with 6 states is now 22?
Yes.
22 states.
So it's in 22 states, and those states continue to do kind of 2 things. I think they use they all use the Charting Life Course framework for that sort of larger systemic change. But then we are also constantly pushing them to say, what are the specific program elements for families, right? Respite, information, navigation, really think about older family caregivers. What are things families actually need as the primary beneficiary? In addition to how are you using Life Course to change person-centered practices and to think differently about things? I think you need both. And so the community of practice is really creating these networks all over the country that are now crossing the systems. And so a number of those systems have crossed into aging, early childhood. A lot of those systems are now taking Charting the Life Course into the school settings and thinking about it for transition planning. So, I just think about this. I can't tell you how many people have said to me wow, they're going to use the exact same tools and language in early childhood so that when my kid goes through their IEPs, we're going to use the same one. And then we're going to get to 14 to 26 and use the same for transition planning. And then in St. Louis, they also then use it for their adult person-centered planning, or they're also using it for post-secondary transition to college.
Right.
And so I don't think you feel like you have all these different segments of systems that you're interacting with.
Yeah, exactly. I'd like to go back to where we started, which is with your family and with your brother. And talk a little bit about aging. So you're aging, he's aging, your parents are aging.
I'm not aging.
You're mistaken, George.
Sorry. How is that? I don't know what the question is other than what advice or how's that impacting you all, and what advice do you have for other families, who are all maturing, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's a really, we are, as a country, have a aging caregiver issue, regardless of disability, right? And then you add the added layer of having a member in the family with a disability. And there is a lot of thinking that has to go into that. And, oftentimes when you're working with families, they don't want to think about what's going to happen when they're gone, no matter what age they are.
Absolutely.
And so how can we help families and professionals interacting with families approach that conversation in a respectful way for when we're kind of nudging them in that direction? I think my parents, and I don't know if this is because Eric was adopted or whatever, but my parents have always recognized, like, no one family member should dictate and dominate the family unit. And that we all at any given time might be the center of the needs. It might be because my dad has health issues, or something's going on with me, or my family, or whatever. And so we always talk about, like, Eric can't always be the center, and like the universe can't just revolve around him. And so,
wow, that's so true.
Yeah, right. And so, are there things that dominate the family? Absolutely, right? But then you also have to balance this other siblings' needs, my parents' needs to have their own life. And so I remember at a very young age, I was always like, I'll just get married and Eric will move in with me, and And my parents were like, yeah, no, that's not going to happen. And I think that there's a couple things that happen in families. There's the family's desire as siblings or other members of the family to do that, not recognizing some of the sort of sacrifices that they might have to make for good or bad, right? And then there are families that just assume that's going to happen.
Right.
And I remember my parents saying, I don't want you to be forced into that choice. If that's a choice you and your husband, and you're in a life stage that you want that to happen, we want to have everything set up for that. And so, they started at a pretty young age with Eric, making sure that he had a special needs trust, really kind of thinking about his services and supports, just like they did for each of us.
Right.
And now it's, they moved Eric out. Eric moved into his own home, in his early 20s, and it was really hard. It was really hard on my parents. But they knew that he had to do it eventually.
Right.
And so if they could start doing it while they were still around, and while they could still support him, to understand that now that's his home and his life. And, I was just with them this weekend, and, they're like, there's nothing greater for a family than Eric comes home every other weekend. When on Sunday they went into his room and all of his stuff's packed up, and they're like, what are you doing? He's like, I'm ready to go home. And he stopped calling his home,
Right.
And it sounds small, but as a family who is aging, who's kind of concerned about their own health, because if one thing happens to them, that whole infrastructure falls apart.
Right.
And, as a sibling, if something happened to my parents, I'm not only either supporting or grieving my parent, then I'm having to figure out how to plan for Eric.
Right.
What we know statistically, and what we know happens in the States, is that when their prep isn't there, that person typically gets removed from wherever they're and get thrown into an environment that isn't really the best fit for them, but no one knows what to do in that crisis situation.
Yeah.
Right.
So you have to figure out how to keep getting those families to think about those little pieces, even when they don't want to.
Yeah, it is hard.
Yeah.
But
I think that's hard for anyone to think through. What are the steps to help my children become independent, and think about our family unit as they get older?
Well, I'll tell you, I think one of our most powerful Charting the Life Course tools, it comes from this conversation. And I went and met with about 5 or 6 families in St. Louis. They said, will you come plan with us? I think it's time we start thinking about the future. And the average age of these 5 people was probably 95. I mean, they were very old. And I said, oh, okay, but what are we going to plan about, you know? And so we now have this principle called, and it's where you think about it's thinking about caring for you or caring about you.
Right.
And so when I first met with these families, they were like, okay, we got this all figured out, Shell. We got a special needs trust. We've got their housing figured out. And we know what provider they're going to use. Mm-hmm. And I said, okay, all right. I said, so who knows how they like to celebrate their birthday? Who's their best friend? Who knows their childhood memories? Who's going to show up at the doctor's office and advocate for them? And it was dead silent in the room. They're like, hold on, that's not what we need a futures plan for. And I said, it absolutely is. Because you know what? All those other things, that provider could go out of business. The rules on HCBS waivers could change. Right. There's all these things that could happen to all those things that you think are planned. Because not any one of our lives stays the same, right? You don't stay in the same home. You don't stay in the same job. Sure. So those things aren't static.
Right.
I said, you have to figure out the people in that person's life. And they couldn't because they hadn't thought. And so we have this tool where we say, now think about who loves that person and think about who can advocate for that person and who's a person that knows their childhood memories or who just loves them unconditionally.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And it is a really, really difficult exercise for families. But what I tell people is start now. So I could be having that conversation with the parents of 3-year-olds or parents of 60-year-olds. Start writing those names down now. Mm-hmm. Because one, you probably have people in your life, but they don't know you think of them in those roles. Sure. And you don't know that you might need to engage them or tell them you're thinking of those in those roles. But that getting someone else to care for your child, especially if you maybe are quirky or have behaviors like my brother, or maybe have some physical things that you're worried that other people don't want to, so you have to try a little harder on identifying the people side of the aging side of the equation.
Right. That's something that I'm thinking of charting the life course tool, and I'm thinking of the star.
Yeah.
Right now that I think has helped me a lot, and I'm watching my own parents kind of go through some of these caregiver challenges. As my aunt has a developmental disability and she's deaf, and her parents have passed, and so she's moved in with my parents, and they're just now thinking we didn't really think through what will we all do in our 60s,
right?
And so I'm watching them kind of grapple with this and think through, and I'm thinking of the star, and I'm like, let's think of all the community supports. Yes. Because they're looking at what's she eligible for, and I'm like, we have to think about all the things, could you get a house cleaner now so you don't have to worry about cleaning your own house? Right. And just starting to think about all the things that support them and what they're doing as a caregiver outside of what's paid services could I get. And so it's just such a neat tool, and it's been so enlightening then to be able to take that knowledge and say, wait, there's actually a lot out there. We can think really creatively.
Yeah. So my mother-in-law is 95, and my father-in-law passed away last year, and she lives in St. Louis and we live in Kansas City. And I mean, she asked us to put cameras in her home because she doesn't want to move out. Right. Yeah. And so, she wakes up in the morning and she, turns her camera on and says hi to my husband and checks in and says goodnight. And it gives her a sense of security. Not everybody wants that, right? Yeah. But it allows us to have, those different supports that, a $200 system from Costco is supporting us to do that.
Right.
And so there are different ways to both provide that support. And I think, we have a caregiver challenge, both in the sense of paid caregivers and family caregivers. Mm-hmm. And so, and not everybody needs 24-hour oversight all the time.
Right.
So it's like you said about thinking about that. And so, a house cleaner is a family support,
Mm-hmm.
right? It gives them time to go do stuff as a family, or,
Right.
do other things, or, so, thinking about those things are really important. And, when we used to talk about family support, we would say it's what the family needs. Like the family might need tires to get the child to an appointment so that
Right.
parents could go to work,
Right.
there's this whole, you can't disconnect some of those things,
Absolutely.
right? And so, there's I think some real opportunities, if it makes sense for families, of like, how are we creating generational living situations? Housing is a situation, there's housing issues right
Mhm.
now. But then it's about thinking about, when we bought our house, 5 years ago, I was like, oh, is it universally designed? What if I need it, or my parents
Right.
need it, right?
Yes.
And so you start thinking very differently, and you can't do that when you're 70. You need to start thinking about
Right.
it younger.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I feel like this conversation could go on and on.
So many things to
Yeah,
discuss.
but maybe we'll have to have Sheli come back. But Sheli, this is great. Is there, if people want to learn more about you, about your programs, where can they go to find out?
Well, I think that I always say that there's like this big portfolio of projects that we support here at UMKC Institute for Human Development. And I think if you live in the state of Missouri, we have the Missouri Family to Family Resource Center. And that should be your go-to place if you're serving families and you don't have time to do it. They can match a family to another family member. They can provide information all over the state about diagnoses, about services and supports. So definitely go to our family to family website. The supportstofamilies.org webpage has that national community of practice that I'm talking about. But the other thing that came out and is on that same website is from the national agenda work that we do. We continue to have policy conversations at the federal level. And so 4 times a year, we have these policy learning collaborative calls where we continue to discuss the national agenda and how that's impacting federal policies across the country and in the states. And anybody can join those listservs or those calls. And then lastly, you mentioned the life course tools. And so if you're a family member or a professional or a director or a leader, you can get on that website. There's a form that you can fill out if you're a family wanting to figure out how to do it yourselves and you can't navigate the website. You'll be directed to our staff at the Family to Family that will help you navigate a plan for yourself. But if you're a professional organization that wants to figure out how to integrate that into your programs or your organizations, you can also get information around training and technical assistance on that. I do have to do a plug every year in Kansas City and coming up in April of 2024, but it's usually April, May of any year, is our annual Trying Life Course Showcase. And so that'll bring together about 500, hopefully more, people from around the country, from a couple other countries as well. And they'll talk about how they're using it for education, early childhood, person-centered planning, how they're using it to support families, how they're using it to support self-determination and leadership development. And it's just, we call it a showcase because it does have conference breakout sessions, but it is very collaborative, high energy, and just people really excited about, they talk about it being a network and a movement and just feeling like a member of really pushing the agenda across all the systems. So definitely have to put a plug in for that.
Yeah,
All right.
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has
Thank
been
you,
great.
Sheli.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
All right.